He counted it twice. $2 bills, soft as cloth, folded so many times the creases had gone white. That was everything he had left in the world, not a dollar more, not a coin. And he was about to hand it to a man who'd already given up on the animal standing in front of him. You've probably been told that a man's worth shows in what he keeps. I'm going to tell you it shows in what he's willing to lose. I worked that auction yard for 19 years. I saw cattle barons drop more on a single bull than most families see in a decade. I saw men weep over horses and men shoot horses without blinking. But I never saw anything like the afternoon. A half-starved cowboy spent his last $2 on an animal the whole county had already written off. A donkey so forgotten nobody had bothered to give it a name. I thought I was watching a fool throw away his last chance. I was wrong. And what happened in the days after still keeps me up some nights, asking myself what I'd have done in his boots. Stay with me, because this one isn't about the money. It never was. The bidding had already stopped when I noticed him. That's the thing about a dead lot at auction. The silence has a texture to it, a kind of embarrassed quiet, like the whole room has agreed not to look at the thing standing in the ring. The donkey stood under the bear bulb in the middle of the sale pen, head low, one ear cocked sideways like it had given up on the other one ever working again. Its ribs showed. Not the soft shadow of a lean animal in summer, actual ribs, each one a rung you could count, the hide pulled tight over them like canvas over a busted tent frame. There was a sore on its left shoulder that had crusted and crusted again. Flies sat on it. The donkey didn't bother to twitch them off. Hollies, our auctioneer, had run through his patter twice already and got nothing. "Come on, folks," he'd said the first time in that sing-song he used. Good worker, gentle, sound of foot. Nobody laughed, but you could feel the room not believing him. The second time he didn't even bother with the kind words. He just said, "I got a no sale here, gentlemen. Last call before he goes to Driscoll." Everybody knew what going to Driscoll meant. Driscoll ran the rendering truck. He paid by the pound for animals that had stopped being animals to anybody and started being weight. I had my ledger open on the rail in front of me. That was my job. I logged every lot, every buyer, every figure in a hand my wife used to say was neater than the schoolteacher's. 19 years of figures. I'd filled 40-some ledgers. When I get nervous or sad or both, I find myself drawing the same little loop at the bottom of a column over and over, a habit I never managed to break. I was drawing it then. No sale, lot 41 I'd written. Donkey, aged, unfit. And under it, the loop, the loop, the loop. Then a voice came from the back, near the loading chute where the light didn't reach. $2. Holly squinted out into the dark. Say again. $2. The man stepped forward into the bad yellow light, and I'll tell you, he didn't look much better fed than the animal he was bidding on. He was maybe 30, maybe 40, hard living makes that hard to tell, with a face burned brown above the collar line and pale below it, the way it goes on a man who works under his hat all day. His boots had been good once. The heels were gone now, worn down on the outside edge, so he stood a little bow-legged, a little tilted, like a fence post the rain's been at. His shirt had been washed so many times the color had left it. He held his hat in both hands against his chest, and his knuckles were big the way a working man's knuckles get, and the two bills were tucked between two of those fingers so you could see them from across the room. The yard went quiet in a different way. Now they were looking. "Son," Holly said, and his voice had softened, which surprised me because Holly's was not a soft man. $2. "Yes, sir." "That's the bid." "That's the bid." Somebody near the front laughed, short and ugly, the kind of laugh a man uses to make sure everybody knows he's not the fool in the room. I knew the laugh. It belonged to Carl Prout, who ran 400 head out past the river and never let you forget it. "Hell, Hollies," Prout called out. "Let him have it. Driscoll won't give you two for that bag of bones anyhow. You'll be paying him to haul it off." There was a murmur of agreement. The kind of agreement that's really just relief that somebody else had stepped into the embarrassing space, so the rest of them didn't have to. Hollies looked down at the donkey. Then he looked back at the man. "You understand what you're buying, friend?" The cowboy didn't answer right away. He looked at the donkey too, really looked, the way you look at a person you recognize but can't place. And the donkey, for the first time since they'd run it into the ring, lifted its head, just a little. Both ears came up. It looked back at him. I don't know how to explain what happened in that man's face. I've thought about it a lot of times since, and I still don't have the words for it. It wasn't pity. I've seen pity, plenty of it, and pity has a softness around the eyes that this didn't have. It was more like recognition, like he'd found something he'd been told was gone. "I understand," he said. "Sold," said Hollies. $2, lot 41. And he brought the gavel down soft, almost gentle, not the crack he gave the real lots. "What's the name for the book?" The cowboy hesitated. "Jess," he said. "Jess Holloway." I wrote it down. Lot 41. Donkey aged, sold $2, J. Holloway. And I'll admit my loop when I drew it that time came out a little crooked. He came to settle up at my table after the last lot, because that was where you paid and signed. Up close he smelled like dust and horse, and something underneath it that I knew too well, the smell of a man who hadn't eaten a full meal in a while, that faint sour edge that comes off the body when it's started feeding on itself. He laid the $2 on the ledger like it cost him something to let go of, which of course it did. "You want me to take him off your hands," I said, and I don't know why I said it except that some part of me wanted to give the man a way out. "Driscoll's still here. He'd take him. You'd at least not be out the two." Jess Holloway looked at me. He had gray eyes, the pale kind, and they were steady in a way that made me feel like I was the one being looked through. "No, sir," he said. "I'll keep him." "Mister," I said, lowering my voice, because Prout and a couple others were still standing around the door jawing, and I didn't want to add to whatever they were saying about him. "I don't mean any disrespect, but that animal's not going to make it through the week. You can see that as well as I can. You'll have spent your last $2 on a hole in the ground." He was quiet for a moment. He folded his hat brim down, then up, then down. A nervous thing his hands did, I think, without him knowing. "Maybe," he said, "but here's how I figure it." He looked back toward the pen, where one of the yard hands was waiting to lead the donkey out. $2 don't fix my life. $2 don't buy me a roof or pay what I owe. It don't even buy me supper and breakfast both. It's not enough money to do anything with. He turned back to me. "But it's enough to keep that animal from ending its days on Driscoll's truck. That's the one thing in this whole room my $2 can actually buy. So that's what I'm buying." I didn't have an answer for that. He signed his name, slow, careful, the signature of a man who didn't do much writing, and he picked up the lead rope, and he walked the donkey out into the failing light. I watched them go. Man and animal, both of them tilted, both of them worn down on the outside edge, going off into the dusk together because neither one had anywhere better to be. I closed my ledger. The loop at the bottom of the page had gone all the way through the paper that time. I'd pressed too hard. What I didn't know then, what I only pieced together later, from the things he told me and the things other people told me, was how much that $2 really was. Jess Holloway had come to our county 11 months before with a wife named Della and a wagon and a Hope. The Hope was a piece of leased ground out past the Caldwell place, dry land, the kind nobody good wanted, which was the only kind a man like Holloway could afford to lease. He'd worked it. Lord, by every account he'd worked it. He put in a winter wheat that the hail took in April. He put in a second planting that the dry took in June. He hired on at the Prout spread for cash money to keep them fed, and he was good help. Even Prout admitted that later, in the grudging way Prout admitted anything. But the cash went out as fast as it came in. To seed and to the doctor. Because Della had gotten sick in the spring. I never met her. By the time I came into their story, she was already 3 months in the ground, out behind the lease place under a wooden marker Jess had cut and planed and lettered himself. Fever, they said. The kind that takes a person in a week and leaves a hole that doesn't close. He'd sold the wagon to pay the doctor who couldn't save her. He'd sold the second mule, then the first. He'd sold his good saddle and kept the bad one. By the day of the auction, Jess Holloway owned a leased patch of failed ground. A lame horse he couldn't sell because nobody'd buy it. The clothes he stood in, and $2. And he spent the $2 on a forgotten donkey. You can call that foolish. A lot of people did. Prout called it worse than foolish, called it the act of a man who'd gone soft in the head with grief. And maybe Prout even half meant it kindly in his way, because the next thing he said was that he'd give Jess his job back come spring if he sobered up his thinking. But I've turned it over more times than I can count, and I've come around to seeing it different. I think Jess Holloway had spent 11 months watching everything he loved get taken from him. The wheat, the money, the mule, the wife, taken by weather and sickness and bad luck, by forces a man can't bid against or argue with or outwork. I think he'd had everything taken. And I think, standing in the back of that auction yard with $2 in his hand, he found himself looking at the one creature in the world that the world had given up on harder than it had given up on him. And for once, for the first time in nearly a year, here was something he could save. Not the wheat, not Della, those were gone, but this he could do. Sometimes a man doesn't spend his last money to be smart. He spends it to remember he's still the kind of man who'd want to. He named the donkey Pilgrim. I found that out about 4 days later when he came back into town. I almost didn't recognize him, not because he looked any better, he didn't, but because of how he was moving. There was a charge to him. He came straight across the square to where I was loading feed sacks into the back of the yard wagon, and he had a look on his face like a man carrying news he can't hold in. "You're the ledger fella," he said, "from the auction." "Tom," I said, "Tom Avery." I put out my hand and he shook it, and his grip had more in it than it had 4 days before. "Mr. Avery, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me straight." He was almost out of breath, though he'd been walking, not running. "That donkey, Pilgrim, where'd he come from before the auction? Whose stock was he? The book'd say, wouldn't it? The book says everything." It struck me as a strange thing to be so worked up about. "Might say," I told him. "We logged the consigner. Why, he giving you trouble?" "No, sir." Jess shook his head, and something moved across his face that I couldn't read. "No trouble. He stopped. Started again. Mr. Avery, that animal knows things. He knows things he's got no business knowing for a donkey nobody wanted. And 4 days ago he led me somewhere out on that ground, and I need to know where he came from because I think—" He stopped himself again, like he'd heard how it sounded. "I think you're going to tell me I'm crazy," he said. I looked at this man. This worn-out, grieving, half-starved man who'd spent his last $2 on a dying animal 4 days ago, and who was now standing in front of me lit up like a lamp, talking about a donkey that knew things. By rights I should have humored him and gone back to my feed sacks. Instead I closed the wagon gate and I said, "Tell me what happened, Jess." Architected narrative continuation with grounded miracle and emotional depth. Architected narrative continuation with grounded miracle and emotional depth. Part 2. He didn't tell me standing in the square. He said it wasn't a square kind of story, and he was right about that. So I did a thing I hadn't done in a long while. I told the yard I was taking the afternoon, and I climbed up on the wagon seat beside him, and we drove out past the Caldwell place to the dry land Jess Holloway had been losing for 11 months. The drive out told me more than he did. I'd heard the ground was bad. I hadn't understood how bad until I saw it with my own eyes, that hard, pale, cracked dirt that takes a seed and gives back nothing. The kind of ground that's been promising men a future since before any of us were born, and breaking them one at a time. There were the stubs of his failed wheat still standing in places, gray and brittle. There was the wooden marker out behind where the soddy stood, and I took my hat off when we passed it, and Jess didn't say anything, and neither did I. And there, by the linta he'd thrown up out of cottonwood poles and a sheet of tin, was Pilgrim. The donkey looked different. For days, that's all it had been, and you couldn't call him well. The ribs were still there. The sore on his shoulder was still healing. He was still an old animal who'd been used hard and left to die. But somebody had cleaned that shoulder and packed it with something. Somebody had brushed the worst of the matting out of his coat. There was a wood trough by the lean-to with water in it, and a little pile of cut grass that Jess must have walked God knows how far to gather by hand, because there wasn't grass like that anywhere on his own ground. The man had been feeding the animal better than he'd been feeding himself. I'd have bet my ledger on it. Pilgrim lifted his head when we drove up. Both ears came forward, and he made a sound, not the awful broken bray of a donkey in distress, but a low rolling thing, almost a greeting aimed straight at Jess. "Hey now," Jess said softly, climbing down. "Hey now, Pilgrim, I brought somebody." I want to set down here exactly what he told me, sitting on an upturned bucket in the shade of that sorry lean-to, because I've never forgotten it and I don't want to get it wrong. The first night, he said, he'd nearly lost him. Jess had walked Pilgrim the 6 miles out from the auction yard, slow, stopping often, and by the time they reached the ground it was full dark and the donkey was trembling so hard Jess could hear his teeth. He didn't have feed. He didn't have money to buy feed. What he had was half a sack of cracked corn meant for his own supper and the next 3 days, and he made a gruel of it with warm water and fed it to the donkey by hand, a palmful at a time, talking to him the whole night through. "I don't know why I talked to him," Jess told me, looking at his own hands. "I've been out there 11 months. Della and me, we talked all the time, even after she got sick, even when she couldn't hardly answer. And then she was gone and there was just quiet. 11 months of quiet. I think maybe I forgot the sound of my own voice." He turned one hand over. "So I talked to a donkey all night, told him about the wheat, told him about her, told him things I never told a living soul." He smiled a little, the first smile I'd seen on him. He didn't judge me none. By morning the trembling had stopped. By the second day Pilgrim was on his feet and following Jess around the lean-to like a dog. And by the third day, Jess said, something changed in the animal that he couldn't account for. He got restless, Jess said. Kept going to the south edge of the ground and standing there, ears up, looking off at that low rise, you can see it from here, that brown swell of land yonder. Kept braying at it, pulling toward it. I figured he was just an old animal, half foolish, wanting to wander. He paused. But he wouldn't quit. 3 days running he did it. And on the 4th morning he got out of the lean-to somehow. I'd tied him, and he got loose, and when I come out he was halfway to that rise, going steady, not wandering, going like he had a place to be. So I went after him. And I said, Jess stood up off his bucket, "Easier if I show you." We walked. Pilgrim came too, falling in beside Jess without being led, and that itself was a strange thing to see, a man and an unhaltered donkey walking together across dead ground like 2 old partners going to check a fence. The rise was farther than it looked, the way things are in that flat country. By the time we topped it I was winded and sweating through my shirt. On the far side the land dropped into a shallow draw, a fold in the prairie you couldn't have known was there until you were right on it, choked with brush and a few stunted hackberry trees. And the bottom of that draw was green. Not much, a patch maybe 40 feet across, but after the gray and the brown and the dead I'd been looking at all afternoon, that green hit me like a shout. Sedges, cattail at the low end, the particular dark, eager green that only grows one place in country like that. "Water," I said. "Spring," said Jess. "Comes up right there under that bank. Runs maybe 100 feet and sinks again, but it runs year-round, near as I can tell, cold and clean and steady." He crouched down at the head of it where the water welled up dark out of the sand, and he cupped a handful and drank, and he looked up at me with those pale gray eyes shining. 11 months, Mr. Avery. 11 months I've been hauling water 2 miles from the Caldwell windmill in barrels, rationing it to my crop, watching the wheat burn up for want of it. And the whole time, there was living water a half-mile from my door, over a rise I never once thought to climb. I knelt and drank too. He was right. It was cold and sweet, the kind of water that tastes like it comes from somewhere deep. "How'd the donkey know?" I said. It wasn't really a question. I was just saying out loud the thing that was sitting on both our chests. "It's what I come to ask you," Jess said. "The book, whose stock was he before? Because a donkey don't dream up a spring." He remembered it. "He worked here, Mr. Avery. Some year some owner, he worked this draw, hauled water out of it or grazed it or I don't know, but he knew it was here. He's known the whole time." Jess looked down at Pilgrim, who had walked to the water and was drinking in long, slow pulls. "He couldn't tell me. He had no way to tell me, so he just pulled south. Every day. Trying to take me to the one thing he knew could save us both." His voice caught. He let it. "And I thought he was just a foolish old animal wanting to wander." We went back to the auction yard that evening, and I pulled the book. I keep them all, every ledger going back 19 years, in a cedar trunk in the office because the mice won't touch cedar. Lot 41 had come in consigned by an estate sale, a widow named Eunice Tate, selling off the last of her late husband's stock out past the river, the husband being a man in a MED Chinese letter. Well, a man named Orville Tate who'd run a small freight and hauling outfit before he passed. And the Tate place, when I checked it against the section map I keep nailed to the office wall, sat on ground that backed right up against the same draw, from the other side. Pilgrim had been a water mule's cousin, near enough. A Tate hauling donkey for who knows how many years, working a route that ran water and freight across that country. He'd drunk at that spring 1,000 times. He'd known it the way you know the road home in the dark. When old Tate died and the stock got sold off, Pilgrim was already aged, already worn, worth nothing to anybody. The widow's agent ran him through the cheapest auction he could find, which was ours, and nobody bid because nobody saw what he was. They saw a bag of bones under a bear bulb. One man saw something worth $2. I wrote it all out in the book that night, the connection, the section numbers, the spring. I don't know why. It wasn't auction business. But it felt like something that ought to be written down somewhere permanent, and my ledgers were the most permanent thing I owned. At the bottom, when I was done, I drew my little loop, and this time, for once, my hand was steady. It would be a fine place to end it, wouldn't it? Poor Cowboy spends his last $2. Dying donkey leads him to living water. The dead land can grow now. The miracles arrived right on schedule. I could close the book there and you could go to bed easy. But that's not where it ended, and I promised you I'd tell it straight. Because 2 days after Jess found that spring, Carl Prout rode out to the Holloway place. And Carl Prout owned the water rights to the whole south section. I need you to understand what that meant out in that country in those years. A spring on your own deeded land is yours. But Jess didn't own his ground, he leased it, dry land, the cheapest there was. And the lease said nothing about water because everyone knew there wasn't any. The spring itself welled up in the draw, and the draw, when you laid the section lines over it the way I'd laid them over my map that night, sat right on the boundary. Half on Jess's lease section. Half on land Prout had bought up 3 years back for the grazing. And water rights in that country didn't go with the lease. They went with the deed. And the man who'd thought to file on the water, the man who'd paid the courthouse fee for rights to all springs, seeps, and flowing sources on that range, back when not a soul believed there was a drop of it to be had, was Carl Prout. Jess found this out the way poor men usually find out such things. Prout rode up on a good horse with a paper in his saddlebag, and he told him. I wasn't there for it. Jess told me after, flat-voiced, sitting on that same bucket with his hat in his hands, working the brim down and up and down. Prout hadn't been cruel about it, Jess said, which somehow made it worse. He'd been almost kindly. He'd looked at the green draw, and he'd looked at the half-mended donkey, and he'd looked at the man who'd spent his last $2, and he'd said something like, Holloway, I'm sorry. I am. But that water's mine on paper, and paper's what holds up. You start watering a crop off my spring, you're taking what's mine, and I can't have that because next year it's somebody else, and the year after that I've got no rights left worth the filing. You understand? It's not personal. And then Prout had made him an offer. Offered to buy my lease out, Jess said. Cash money. More than I figured the ground was worth, more than I figured anything I owned was worth. Said he'd take the lease, take the spring with it, run his cattle on it. Said I could take the money and start clean somewhere else. Jess looked up at me. It's a fair offer, Mr. Avery. It's more money than I've seen in a year. It'd pay what I owe and put a stake in my pocket and let me walk away from this ground that's done nothing but bury what I love. What? He was quiet a long moment. And it means leaving her, he said, out back under that marker. It means selling the only piece of earth that's still got Dello in it, to the one man who can use the water I found while I take his money and go. He turned his hat. Prout wants his answer by Sunday. The light was going down. Pilgrim stood by the trough, watching us with those long ears, an old animal who'd led a broken man to the one thing that could save him, and in the saving had handed him the hardest choice of his life. I didn't know what to tell him. I still don't know that I'd have known what to say if he'd asked. But he didn't ask. He just sat there in the failing light, a man with a fair offer in one hand and his wife's grave at his back, turning his hat, turning it. I got my coat. What he'd figured out, sitting on that bucket those 4 days, was a thing so simple I was ashamed I hadn't thought of it myself, and so hard to pull off that I understood why he'd needed every hour of those 4 days to find the nerve. He wasn't going to sell, and he wasn't going to steal Prout's water either. He'd settled it in his own head somewhere between those two, in a place I don't think Prout had even considered a man like Jess could reach. Prout's got the rights, Jess said as we rode out under a thin moon. I'm not arguing that. The paper's the paper, but the paper says he owns the water. It don't say he owns what a man might do for it. He'd worked it through. I'm going to offer to lease the water from him, same as I lease the ground. Pay him for it not in cash. I got no cash, but in labor. I'll work his spread same as I did before, but I'll work it for water 'stead of wages. He gets a hand he was going to have to hire anyway, and he keeps every drop of his rights free and clear on paper forever. And I get to water my crop, and I get to stay. He turned in the saddle to look at me. And I get to keep her where she is. I'll tell you the truth. I didn't think Prout would take it. I'd known Carl Prout 20 years. He was not a generous man, and he was not a sentimental one, and he had a fair offer already on the table that got him the lease and the water both. Why would he trade a clean buyout for the bother of a labor lease and a tenant on his border? We rode up on the Prout place near midnight. There were still lamps lit. Prout came to the door in his shirt sleeves, and when he saw who it was his face did something complicated. It's late, Holloway. Yes, sir, I know it. I got my answer and I couldn't sit on it till Sunday. Jess stood square on the porch, hat in his hands, the moon behind him. I'm not selling. Prout's jaw set. Then you're not watering either. We've been over this. I know, so I come to make you a different offer. And he laid it out, the labor lease, the water for work, the rights staying with the deed. Clean, fair. He didn't beg. That's the thing I remember most. He didn't beg, not once, though he had more reason to beg than any man I ever saw. He just stated it, the way you'd state a price, and then he stood quiet and let it sit. Prout listened. He looked past Jess, out into the dark, toward where the donkey and the spring and the grave all lay invisible under the night. Why, Prout said finally, why not take the money? It's good money. You'd be a fool not to. Because the money buys me out, Jess said. And there's something out there I'm not for sale on. You found the water on paper, Mr. Prout, 3 years back when nobody believed in it. That was good thinking and it's yours. But I found it in the world 2 days ago with a $2 donkey after 11 months of hauling barrels past it like a blind man. We both found the same water. Seems to me there's room in that for both of us to use it if you're willing. And if you're not, he shrugged, and it was the most tired and most dignified shrug I ever saw a man make, then you'll have to put me off it and I'll go, but I won't sell it to you. There's a difference. I don't expect you to see it, but there is. There was a long silence on that porch. I have thought many times since about what moved Carl Prout that night. I don't think it was charity. Prout didn't have much of that. I've come to believe it was something closer to recognition. The same thing I'd seen on Jess's face in the auction ring, passing now across Prout's hard features. One man looking at another and seeing, maybe for the first time, the actual size of him. My fences on the north quarter are down in 4 places, Prout said at last, gruffly, like the words cost him. Been down since the spring. I've been short a hand to fix them. I can fix fence, Jess said. I know you can. You're the best hand I ever had and the only one with the sand to walk up on my porch at midnight and tell me no. Prout looked at him a moment longer. Water for work. We'll draw it up proper with Avery here to witness, so there's no question down the road for either of us. The rights stay mine. The rights stay yours, Jess agreed. And Holloway, Prout paused in his own doorway. That donkey, the one led you to it. Something almost like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth and died there. $2. $2, Jess said. Cheapest water I ever near lost, said Prout and shut the door. We drew it up that week in my neat ledger hand and I witnessed it and it held. I want to be honest about the size of the miracle because the word miracle gets thrown around easy and I've come to distrust it. Nobody got rich. The spring was small. Jess didn't turn that dead ground into a paradise. Dry land is dry land and 100 feet of spring won't change the rain. But it was enough to water a kitchen garden and a few acres of feed and a stand of fruit trees he put in the next spring, and it was enough to keep a man and a donkey alive on ground they had no business surviving on. It was enough to stay. For Jess Holloway, after the year he'd had, staying was the whole of the miracle. He didn't ask for more than that. He worked Prout's fences and quarters for years, earned wages again eventually, when Prout quietly converted the labor lease back to cash work once the point had been made and the water was settled and neither man needed to keep proving anything to the other. They were never friends, exactly, but I'd see them sometimes, leaning on the same fence at day's end, not talking much, 2 men who'd come to an understanding that neither would ever put into words. Della stayed where she was, the marker's still out there. Jess kept it lettered clean and the grass off it, all those years, and he never did sell that ground, not for any price, though there came a time much later when the price got high. Pilgrim lived 4 more years. That's the part I find I can't get all the way around, even now. 4 years. For a $2 donkey that wasn't supposed to make it through the week, that's a long time and a short one. He never worked again, not really. Jess wouldn't put him to it. He let the old animal graze the green draw he'd found and drink the water he'd remembered and grow fat and slow and easy, the only creature on that hard land that got to live out its days with nothing asked of it. Jess said he'd earned it. Jess said a thing once that I wrote down because it seemed to me worth keeping. Everybody in that auction yard looked at him and saw what was gone, he said. The years that were used up, the work that was wore out of him, they priced him by what was behind him. He was watching the donkey graze when he said it. I was the only one fool enough or low enough or maybe just empty enough to wonder what might still be in him, and it turned out the one thing still in him was the one thing I needed to live. He shook his head. $2. People say I saved his life. I never could make them understand it was the other way round.